hello everyone, and welcome to this online launch event for the Monitoring Lethal Force website. My name is Stephen Skinner, and I will be introducing and chairing this event this afternoon. I'm a law professor and a member of the team of academics based at the University of Exeter in the UK, which has led the development of the Monitoring Lethal Force project and website. As you will all have seen, I hope, from the invitation, this new website is designed to support international monitoring of the use of lethal force by policing and law enforcement officials around the world. And here in this context, lethal force means uses of force in law enforcement and policing activities that result in or are otherwise connected with deaths. By providing detailed and comparable reports on the recording, regulation, and use of lethal force in a number of jurisdictions around the world, the website is intended to enhance the accountability of policing and law enforcement agencies, and ultimately to contribute to improving practices and reducing numbers of deaths. This work has been made possible by funding from the Open Society Foundations, whose support we gratefully acknowledge. And this work has been developed with a number of collaborators and expert contributors around the world. Due to time constraints, I can't introduce all of them individually because there are too many of them, but some of them will be introducing themselves during this launch, and the website provides details of their names and institutional affiliations. This launch will now consist of a series of 6 short presentations about the detail of the Monitoring Lethal Force website, which will be followed by an opportunity to ask questions. So please save your questions for that part of the launch. What I will now do is introduce each of the speakers, and then at the end of their presentation, I'll move on and introduce the next person and bring them in. So as I say, we have 6 short presentations now. So to begin with, to outline the aims and scope of the Monitoring Lethal Force website, we have our first presenter, Brian Rappert, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Exeter.
Great. Okay, thanks, Stephen, and thanks everyone for joining. So that's right. Let me give you a little bit of context and background about the Lethal Force Monitor, and tell you a little bit about what we've been able to do in this project. So, yes, begin here. So what are our ultimate aims here through this project? One is that we want to reduce all deaths from the use of force by law enforcement officials. And another is we're seeking to find ways of enhancing the responsiveness of law enforcement agencies to deaths that take place because of use of force. Okay, and the way we've gone about do this is we've gone about developing a mechanism for monitoring comparatively policies and practices associated with the use of force in different law enforcement agencies. And as well as part of this project that Stephen mentioned, we've built an international network of people, some of whom you're going to hear from today, who are interested in monitoring and evaluating police use of force. And we're seeking to work together to develop standards, to develop a set of kind of common working principles by which we can look at use of force issues worldwide. Okay, so why, just take a step back from kind of what specifically we've done here. Well, why is comparing deaths across law enforcement agencies important? I mean, we think there's a number of reasons for this. One is that, I mean, international law, gives some standards and requirements in terms of what police agencies are meant to be doing, but how those are translated into practice is an important consideration. And we want to understand across countries how that's been done. Pragmatically, it's useful to do comparative research because you can find out, you can try to identify good practice and maybe sometimes, not so good practice. And that's part of what we want to achieve through this project. And also a lot of the responses of criminal justice agencies, are rooted in the traditions, in the histories of those organizations. And what may look as kind of normal or standard or something you wouldn't question, practices that happen in one state, they're not the practices of another. And we want to ask this question about what else might be done, what could be done differently in terms of how police agencies work. Okay? So it's just a little bit of the rationale for why we've done this analysis. So yeah, we've developed a lethal force monitor. To call it global at this stage is, maybe, but we have a number of countries internationally in varied contexts that we've been able to compare across similar kinds of frameworks. And so I'm just going to mention those briefly here. Some work that's been done by colleagues, particularly that's started in Latin America about comparative indicators, legal frameworks, which has come out of University of Pretoria, and some work that colleagues at University of Exeter and others have led about policing policies and practices. So basically, the monitor takes these three strands and kind of brings them together. So let me just say, I'm just going to say very, very briefly about each of them. If you don't know this website, the Law on Police Use of Force Worldwide, it's definitely worth visiting. This is the work that's taken place out of the University of Pretoria, and Thomas is going to speak to his work, which is related to this a little bit later. But basically, this provides a kind of database about the kind of laws and provisions in place worldwide about police use of force. Okay, so that's a source that we've taken for this monitor. For some countries, we've updated it, we've expanded it, and so on. But this is the kind of legal framework analysis we wanted to work with. Oops. In terms of the comparative indicators that I mentioned, as I say, the group of people in Latin America that has started with this work, and you're going to hear from Ignacio later, basically trying to say, okay, well, let's look at quantitative information about police use of force in different jurisdictions, and let's find a way of being able to compare across jurisdictions. Right? So, I mean, of course, we would want to know the number of civilians who have been killed in any particular jurisdiction, but we might want to relate that to any number of other indicators, like how many inhabitants there are, what's the population size, how many times are the police arresting individuals, and so on. So there are these kind of use indicators, and then there are also abuse indicators, where you're trying to look at, can we develop measures for where we might get a handle on how the use of force is becoming problematic, it's being something that needs to looked into. So if you can compare, for instance, how many civilians are dying in police incidents versus number of police officers dying, how many people are injured versus wounded, injured versus killed in incidents and so on. This can maybe give a handle on where there's abuse concerns. Okay, so that's another strand of work that's been happening already, but that we've brought into this lethal force monitor. And then there's a series of work that some of us at the University of Exeter and elsewhere have been involved with, where we've asked these questions about accountability. Okay, so when there's a death, how do the police respond in terms of their practices? What sort of information is available? What's the quality of that information? What's the ability of law enforcement agencies to look as if they've learned lessons from the past? And that's work that's happened in Europe and also in Africa. And now we've expanded that out. Okay, so this new monitor we have, this website, brings together these different strands of work, expands them out, and realizes them for particular countries. So I'm going to, just in case you haven't seen it, I'll put the web link in the chat just as soon as I'm finished. But basically, what the website allows you to do is to look over the different countries that we've analyzed, and there's a listing of them, on top of the screen there, and across the different kinds of dimensions that you want to study too. So what are you interested in? And then, as part of this website, you can compare across countries and just to see how practices vary. There are also country reports, and they'll go into considerable detail about what's happening in each jurisdiction. We talk about other publications related to use of force issues that the team's been involved with, and so on. But anyway, what we're trying to do is provide a resource here, right, that can ground analyses of police use of force, the kind of policies and practices in place for that. Okay, so with that, I'll draw that to a close, and back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Brian, for that outline of the website. Next, we have Ignacio Cano, who's Professor of Sociology at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, who will present a regional summary of Latin America.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to be presenting very briefly the work that a network of scholars and activists has been carrying out in Latin America and the Caribbean for the last 6-7 years. We are now in the third wave, and we have 9 participating countries that you can read on the screen, from Brazil, Chile, Colombia, El Salvador, Jamaica, Mexico, Peru, Trinidad and Tobago, and Venezuela. We calculate, as Brian indicated, 2 types of indicators. On one hand, incidence indicators, which allow us to see how many people get killed by the action of law enforcement agents compared to the population, the number of security agents, a number of arrests and guns confiscated. You can see it on the screen that in Brazil, over 5,000 people get killed every year through the action of the police, or in other cases, for example, military officials who are carrying out duties of public security. But most of them are carried out by the police. When we calculate the rate by 100,000 inhabitants, we see that Jamaica holds the first place with 4.23 dead civilians for every 100,000 inhabitants. When we talk about the ratio of the people killed to the number of public security officers, then Brazil is on top with over 11 deaths per 1,000 security agents every year. When we see also that Trinidad and Tobago has very high numbers with 5.13 people killed per 100,000 inhabitants. But then probably the most interesting part is the abuse indicators. So use of force can be very common, but it may be justified in some areas where there is a threat to the life of the agents or of other people. And what we have tried to achieve is a measurement that allows us to see whether use of force is excessive in some countries. And we try to measure the principle of comparability of proportionality in practice. So is the use of force proportional to the threat the public security agents are facing? And you can see that, for example, these first indicators is a percentage of all homicides committed by state agents while on duty. And you can see that in Venezuela, for example, even though we have no official data, data from the press indicates that 25.3% of all homicides are committed by police officers. So 1 in 4 of all homicides are committed by the state, which is an extraordinarily high number. In Trinidad and Tobago, this is 17.2 with official data, and in El Salvador is 15. All those numbers exceed the reasonable expectation that no more than 10% of all homicides should be committed by law enforcement agents. The second indicator is the ratio between the civilians killed and the law enforcement agents killed. Again, the limit, according to international studies, is 10-1. If more than 10 civilians are killed for every law enforcement agent killed, then this is a clear indication of excessive use of force. We can see that in Brazil, for example, in 2022, for every police officer killed, there were 221.8 civilians killed, which is an extraordinarily high number that reveals excessive use of force. The third indicator is what we call a lethality index, which is a ratio of the people killed to the people wounded. There should be more people wounded than killed if the intent is not to kill but to stop the person. You can see in the region, in many countries like in El Salvador 3.1, in Mexico 3.07, in Trinidad 3.8, 4.6. The number of dead victims is much higher than the number of wounded victims, which again is a very clear indicator of excessive use of force. And the fourth column is what we call lethality ratio, which is a ratio of the lethality index against civilians and the lethality index against law enforcement officers. And you can see that, for example, in Trinidad, the lethality ratio against civilians is 18 times higher than that indicator when applied to law enforcement officers. In El Salvador is 6 times higher. In Mexico is again 6 times higher. So the kind of lethality behavior by the police is much higher of that behavior committed against the police, which again questions the application of the principle of proportionality. So my time is up, and as indicated by Brian, we are part of this broad network that has three components: accountability, indicators of use and abuse, and normative structure on the use of force. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ignacio, for sharing that breakdown of the lethality index and data about Latin America. So next, our following speaker is Abby Diamond, who is Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Exeter, who will present a regional summary of Europe. Over to you, Abby.
Hello everyone, and thanks so much for coming. It's great to be here. And what I wanted to do just quickly is just to provide a very quick overview of some of the key themes coming out of the countries that we've looked at in Europe. Obviously, we are quite pushed for time, so please do, I'd really encourage everyone to have a look at the website and to dig into a bit more detail. But in this presentation then, we'll be looking very briefly at 4 countries we've covered. So that's England and Wales, France, and the Netherlands, for whom we looked at all of the 3 different components outlined by Brian and Ignacio, and then also Belgium, where in an earlier report we looked at policies and procedures and transparency around lethal force more broadly. So Brian, if you could move me on to the next slide. What I'm going to do then is just very quickly look at each of these components in turn. So first the legal frameworks, then the policies and procedures, and then the comparative indicators as discussed by Ignacio. So looking at the legal framework side of things, as has already been noted, here we drew on information from the policinglaw.info website and looked at things like the adherence to global and regional human rights treaties, as well as UN decisions and advisory opinions that had been issued for the jurisdictions in question. We also looked at any regional court judgments that had been issued, as well as national court judgments. Also then looked at national legal frameworks and investigations by official agencies into killings following police use of force as well. So some of the issues that we saw across countries in Europe then were concerns about adherence to international standards around necessity, proportionality, and firearms use, including in the Netherlands, where some have expressed concern about these issues. But more broadly then also, often we encountered a lack of clarity about the extent to which national frameworks were indeed compatible with the ECHR, as well as often kind of practical uncertainty about the rules governing firearms. And this was the case, for example, in France, following the introduction of a new law, and was also indicated by the recent so-called W80 case in England and Wales as well. We also found a need to do more to ensure the independence and the transparency of investigations into injuries and deaths, including some rulings made with regards to France in this regard, and also found a variety of national practices around the extent to which weapons-specific regulations and instructions were issued, as well as the ease of us accessing them. So that then, I think, takes us nicely onto the next slide and onto the next component that we looked at. And here we were really concerned with looking at policies and procedures around data collection and publication, so the extent to which there were readily available official statistics in these areas, as well as the quality of the data that was gathered. And here we found that in the 4 states we looked at in Europe, most states did collect at least some data in this area, but we found that publication practices differed widely. So, for example, in England and Wales, as we can see on the slide here, there was a publication made by the independent oversight body, but we also had a range of different practices in other countries. For example, countries like Belgium, where some data on deaths following police use of force was collected, but wasn't always proactively published. And then through to France, where we have seen some improvements recently in terms of the data collection processes implemented by the National Police and the National Gendarmerie. But I think it's fair to say that in all of these jurisdictions, then we did see significant gaps in the data that was gathered, as well as gaps in the analysis that was conducted. And one area that I think exemplifies this quite well is looking at accountability and the outcomes of any investigations that did take place following loss of life from subsequent to police use of force. Here we found across all of the countries that we looked at in Europe then that data was really incomplete and often was approximate. Even with these gaps in data, we were able to see that there was quite low rates of prosecutions for officers and other officials over the last 2 years, 10 years, with numbers ranging from between 1 to 8 officers prosecuted. And we also found it was even rarer for law enforcement agencies themselves to face any kind of convictions following issues in this area. And then finally, I know I'm tight on time, but just in the last minute that I had left, I just wanted to move to the last slide and look at comparative indicators. So when we compare to some of the countries that we were looking at in Latin America and following Ignacio's analysis, we can see that where indicators in Europe were able to be calculated, the numbers tended to be relatively low. So, for example, in the countries that we looked at, we had between 17 to 26 civilians killed in the years in question, which in turn translated into relatively low contextual indicators when looked at internationally. But interestingly, we often found that a lot of information was missing that would allow us to do the kind of analysis that was demonstrated by Ignacio. So, for example, in England and Wales, there were gaps around injuries inflicted on civilians and gaps around the extent of officer injury and officer deaths. In France, we also had gaps on arrest data, and some of these data gaps really made it difficult for us to really produce these kind of comparative indicators. And so in conclusion then, we found that, yes, there was a need for enhanced data collection and publication in various respects, but that this was necessary but not sufficient. And really across the board, more needed to be done, not just to gather the data and to publish it, but also to act on it, to ensure that lessons were learnt and previous recommendations implemented, including recommendations made at the national level, but also those that have been made internationally as well. So with that then, let me pass back to Stephen, and thanks again.
Thank you, Abby, for that summary of some of the key issues that have arisen and been noted in the European context. So our next speaker is Tariq Weeks, who is a research fellow in the Centre for Criminal Justice and Security at the University of the West Indies. And Tariq will present a regional summary of the Caribbean. Thank you. Over to you, Tariq.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I just want to say that I'm happy to be part of this effort. The issue that Ignacio spoke earlier, and following on from what we just heard from our previous presenter, the region is one that's very uneven when it comes to the reporting of fatal shootings. So even when you look at the structure of oversight, this very different. We have parliamentary commissions in St. Lucia, Jamaica, and Trinidad. These are mandated bodies to report and collect data on police fatal shootings. But these bodies also lack reporting capabilities and publication routines, right, that could help us better understand fatal shootings. So this is something that we see in those particular countries. Now, the other countries like Antigua, St. Kitts and Nevis that have also seen an uptick, for example, in homicides, they too are in a similar position where I would say they have less of the capacity that we see in Jamaica and Trinidad, much less. And in terms of reporting in the media, they do not do such as well. So the region has a very uneven landscape in terms of reporting on fatal shootings. They do also, this must be appreciated in the context of what type of institutions that exist. Most of them are still paramilitary organizations, and they have this very colonial reference points embedded in the legislation. Trinidad and St. Lucia's legislation and Jamaica's legislation, sorry, while they make reference to violence and use of force, they don't explicitly point out use of force by police organizations. And so the reference points in these types of legislation need to be changed. They've gone ahead in doing reforms in Trinidad and Jamaica, reforms particularly around, professionalizing the police force. But these reference points still remain, these paramilitary reference points still remain. And so it causes some kind of friction in those countries regarding what exactly the police are supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. The use of force policies exist in both Trinidad and Jamaica, for example. Other Caribbean countries' use of force policies, like St. Lucia and St. Kitts, are available but not publicly present online. So I've been told they are in offices, but they're not public. And so it's very difficult to get information on how use of force is represented in these countries. But the point is that there also needs, just like what you've seen in the work of the Latin American project that Nasser reported on, there also needs to be a similar harmonization around practices, right, for fatal shooting reporting, right, and the legislation that should actually inform how officers are prosecuted, how they're treated regarding the use of force. The last thing I would want to say is that I have argued that we still are in a very under-researched position in the region, especially the English-speaking region, regarding fatal shootings. When you look at the data that you get, right, out of the countries, even Jamaica, which I consider to be, the leading countries in reporting, do have big gaps, right, in the reporting on fatal shootings. For example, in Jamaica, we don't have any information reported on the rank of police officers involved in fatal shootings, right? We don't have any ages, we don't have any other particulars that would suggest to us a kind of analysis that we see in the fatal shootings literature regarding, race on race, same race fatal shootings participants, for example, or same ethnicity relations in or associations, in fatal shooting participants. The other is that even information on age in Jamaica's data set, for example, was lacking. Only about 50% of the cases involving on-duty officers, on and off-duty officers, actually had information on age, right? So there can be improvements on those things. The last thing is that in terms of the under-researched position context, we don't know enough around the networks that exist within police organizations, right, that are involved in fatal shootings. So we understand both in St. Lucia, Trinidad, and Jamaica, there have been death squads, right, of police officers killing criminals or allegedly criminals and not facing any kind of impunity or slow hearings. These countries have had, networks of police officers, but we don't understand if it's new recruits, right? All of the participants are new recruits, or is a mixture of new and senior officers, and senior officers carrying a kind of squaddy culture around fatal shootings and how persons should be treated. So there's still, the region, I would say, and this is what this report has also brought to light, is that the region is still very much young, right, in its research around fatal shootings, and could be much further in helping us direct policy if we at least got a little bit further than just reporting on very simple stats, right, regarding participants and organization involvement. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Tariq, for that overview of some of the issues you've encountered in the Caribbean region, and particularly picking up on some of the gaps in information and some of the things that we don't know. So with that idea in mind, our next speaker is Thomas Probert, who heads the Freedom from Violence Research Group at the Center for Human Rights in the University of Pretoria. And his presentation focuses similarly on some of the issues that we do not yet know in monitoring lethal force, with specific reference to some African jurisdictions. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, so I'm going to follow the pattern of previous presentations and think about these kind of three categories of inquiry that have formed part of the web resource that we're launching today. Specifically thinking about the African region. So far on the website, we've looked at 3 countries in Africa, South Africa and Kenya. You have to look in slightly different places on the website, but reports both on the procedures and on the comparative indicators for South Africa and Kenya, and then in Sierra Leone, the one example where we've pulled it all together into one place, and we've chosen those 3 countries for a reason that I think will become obvious in a moment. But to begin with respect to the legislation, where that website does survey the whole continent, the question is not so much whether or not we've been able to find the legislation, but as the recent study that the African Commission undertook into use of force legislation on the continent, the fact that there are an alarming number of countries in the region that don't have specific legislation relating to the use of force. And so conduct of the police with respect to use of force falls back on, in some instances, as in Sierra Leone, constitutional provisions around circumstances in which a death may or may not be arbitrary. And in a smaller subset of countries, there's not even that. One consequence of that kind of legislative vacuum is that we also don't see in a lot of African countries examples of case law arising in national courts from which we can infer, and critically the police can infer, the relevant legal tests for their use of force. There is a certain amount of regional jurisprudence. The African Commission has a small number of cases related to the use of force, and hopefully their generation of soft law standards over the last several years is an indication that they are looking to take on more cases with respect to this issue. In the meantime, one of the sub-regional courts, the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice, has taken on quite a number of cases related to use of force, including cases against Sierra Leone that we document on the site. With respect to the investigation of specific incidents and then the aggregation of statistics about those cases, the three countries we've looked at are those 3 countries that have got independent specialized agencies: IPID in South Africa, IPOA in Kenya, and the Police Conduct Board in Sierra Leone. Those mechanisms are stretched. You're talking between 350 and 500 lethal incidents in South Africa, 100 to 200 in Kenya, and an unknown number in Sierra Leone. Our report documents at least 20 having occurred last year, but that is not actually reliant upon the Complaints Board's data, but rather what is more often the case in countries in the region, that is that information about police use of force arises not because of a centralized investigative body, but rather because of an ad hoc inquiry brought about because of a specific high-profile incident. And so drawing inferences about day-to-day practice from that singular example is fraught with risk. In some other instances, I should say, there are general a human rights body, a commission or otherwise, that has a general investigative mandate and that does investigate policing incidents, but isn't a specialized agency. And in fact, in the Sierra Leone case, I think we draw more information from the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone than we do from the Police Complaints Board. With respect to the contextual information, as Abby was highlighting in Europe, I think some of the necessary data, police injuries being a particularly difficult one to get accurate information about. Most countries do report officers killed, and there's reasonable information around the number of homicides, less concrete information around the number of weapons seized. That makes, I think, gathering information about the comparative indicators on the African continent somewhat difficult. Moving forward, we've seen the setting up of similar investigative mechanisms recently in Malawi and Zambia, which I think could make promising examples for future research. And Nigeria, there are a lot of mechanisms that exist in Nigeria pulling on different pieces of this. And so an analysis of how that patchwork can supply some of the data we're looking for would also, I think, be a valuable contribution to the site. But yes, there's a lot of further research to do, I think, of lethal force on the African continent.
Thank you, Thomas, for that overview of some of the issues we've encountered in relation to African jurisdictions and some of the further areas requiring investigation, perhaps as we develop this in the future. Thank you for that. So we move now to our sixth speaker, continuing our virtual voyage around the world and around time zones. And I'm very pleased to introduce Joel Ariate, who's a researcher at the Third World Studies Center at the University of the Philippines, who will address, again, some of the absences and gaps in information that we have about monitoring lethal force. And who will also, I think, consider some of the reasons why we do not yet have complete knowledge about lethal force. So, Joel, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Last January 9, 2024, Philippine President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. announced in a video message intended to make the rounds of various social media platforms that his communications team banks on for his political messaging that 177 police officers in Metro Manila alone have been charged with drug-related offense, ranging from planting of evidence, unlawful arrest, and excessive violence. Marcos's announcement was made in line with his administration's effort to distance itself from the bloody drug war of the previous Duterte government and to signal new efforts at making police accountable for policing practices that has now become almost institutional impunity. 3 days later, on January 12, came the news from the chief of the National Capital Region Police Office that the actual folders bearing the files of the erring police officers are missing. He also admitted that the decisions on cases involving members of the National Police, when not lost, are tampered with, resulting in reduced penalties, or the enforcement of judgment is endlessly delayed. 4 days later, on January 16, the spokesperson of the Philippine National Police issued a clarification that all of the records were intact, that the real problem was that one office was looking for the case files in one storage area where they thought the file should be. Then the other office simply failed to properly turn over the case files. Of the 13 completed national reports included in this online repository of lethal force monitors, the Philippines, fresh out of a murderous drug war, to some degree veers towards the extreme when it comes to the number of people killed by gunshot by on-duty law enforcement agents at 0.34 per 100,000 civilian inhabitants. Yet, when it comes to data on the lethal use of force by law enforcement agents, as well as judicial and oversight processes that should have rendered this data and incidents public and transparent, the Philippine government can be said to be an example of how a state can both obscure information it has and at the same time points to laws and institutions that guarantee an accumulation of data that should inform policies on policing and judicial redress. We would like to think that the opacity of policing data eventually likens as a state or a government adheres more closely to democratic principles, that it aspires to a bureaucracy that the people can trust. But as is proven by most of the country reports in this website, the researchers battle not so much with patent obfuscation from the state agencies, but how the pretense of hearing out one's request for access to information, notwithstanding laws on freedom of information or access to government data, are the dark and narrow alleys of the bureaucracy where attempts at making public information adverse to the police and the state are waylaid and put an end to. Related to this is the effort of some governments to create various committees and commissions that by design overlap with each other so that they could respond with almost a certain degree of reasonableness that they were expecting the other agencies to do the tasks that are expected of them. There is also the modeled characterization of who the police are and what inherent deference or degree of impunity they are bestowed by the state. Recent democracies, or those that pride themselves with democratic credentials, have granted the police immunity from legal actions. Their use of lethal force in the conduct of their duty are imbued with presumption of regularity and exemption from accountability. The degree of scrutiny by the state also varies between federal and local or state police. States with a long history of insurgency or civil conflict have militarized police that in some instances acts as Praetorian guards of whoever is in power. In almost all instances, the police's use of lethal force may be known to select state actors whose duty now includes safeguarding the information that may put into question why lethal violence was resorted to in dealing with the civilian population. These are then the bureaucrats that will put out annual reports with the bare minimum of information. There's a number for those who died in police operations, the number of law enforcement agents who were killed or wounded, but they will not explain how the numbers were put together. Many research groups in this network have resorted to scouring information from the news media or relying on information from civil society organizations. But information culled from media sources or non-government organizations are so value only to the extent that these are gathered freely and not the product of misinformation or propaganda. Hence, the need to compare them with official data. But if there is no information infrastructure put in place by the state in the first place, if there is no institutional history of informing the public on how lethal a police force can be, there is always the maneuver as demonstrated by the Philippine government. Allude to the information, lose the information, find it again. Now the news story is about police brutality, corruption, and incompetence, but on how it has all the data all along. Investigation will be promised. Then it is a new news cycle. In the face of this situation that verges on the absurd, were it not for the people getting maimed and killed, the need for a lethal force monitor remains ever pressing, ever justified. Thank you.
Joel, thank you very much for that reminder of the need for efforts like this to try and shed light into dark places, as it were, and your reminder of the issues of militarization and obfuscation that really need to be addressed very seriously. Thank you so much. So that brings us to the final part of the launch event today, and we have around 15 minutes for some questions. So this is your opportunity, those of you who've joined us. Thank you for raising issues, joining the discussion, and asking questions to people who've presented or perhaps other members of the team. I'll be chairing this part, so I'd be grateful if you could use the raise hand function on your Zoom screen. So if you're not sure where that is, if you see on the bottom, there's the reactions button. In there, you'll find raise hand, and that will draw my attention to you. And then I can take questions in order. And then if you would perhaps like to indicate very briefly who you are, very briefly, and perhaps indicate to whom you would like to address your question, that would be useful. And we will take questions in order. So over to you. If anyone would like to ask a question, make a comment, or seek further information or contribute, please do so. Okay, so the first hand raised that I can see there is Nick. I can see your name. I can't see you, but I can see your name. So Nick, please. Hello.
Hi, can you see me now? Yeah. Okay, great. Firstly, fabulous work. Thank you to everybody who has sort of led this and kept it going as well, because there's been some obstacles along the way. So it's fantastic that it's still going, and also that you've incorporated all the other work that was sort of going on around the globe, which is a real achievement. My question is really about sort of the future and what comes next from a digital technology perspective, and I wonder what opportunities there are from the sort of the digital space, from an AI perspective, from those sort of angles that might assist and support the collection, more comprehensive collection of data. I don't know whether any of the presenters have any thoughts or ideas on that.
Hey, thank you. So while my co-team members are thinking about whether they have thoughts on that, my initial response would be certainly in terms of international data technology. I think there's an awful lot in terms of sharing information through alternative channels. Like, this isn't answering your question directly, like blogs, online journals and things. And I think that is a really important way of spreading this and getting this out to different sectors. In terms of AI and data management, data collection, clearly there are sort of technical and ethical issues there that we need to be thinking about. But I think that is an important one. I don't know if Brian or if any of the other team members have thoughts about that.
I could just add from the African perspective that while I think there's an appeal to thinking about using AI to scrape, as I think both Tariq and Joel highlighted the role of media reporting in undergirding and kind of validating, filling in official gaps. I think increasingly even quite local media now does have an online presence, and so if you were to look to scrape all of that information and to train some kind of search algorithm to understand what a police shooting or death following interaction with the police looked like, there's a possibility there, but it does still ultimately fall back on the extent to which the topic is covered and how much kind of local media attention there is to these questions. And so where there's already a lot of attention focused, you'll get good results, and in the places where arguably more attention needs to be focused, it will get missed. So there's a risk of kind of the digital divide replicating discrimination and kind of data gaps.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. That's helpful because it's really important to remember some of the presentations have picked up on some of the sources of information. If it's media and alternative sources, that's open on the web, can be traced, and it's great, as we've been saying. If it's official, then how will the AI get access to what isn't perhaps being made open? So that is a concern. Right, Ignacio wants to come in on that. Thank you.
Yes, just to add that within the Latin American network, our colleagues at the University of Chile have developed a web scraping tool to try to get access to those relevant cases in the media. And success had been mixed in that in small countries, it can get to work properly and you can identify most cases, but in big countries, in federal countries, it's very hard, like Brazil and Mexico, it's very hard to get access to most cases because in the first place, when you have over 5,000 people killed, then the press is not going to publish every case. So there is a very limited access to the number of cases. And then secondly, the number of outlets is very high. So our success has been mixed, but if anyone would like to know more about this, they can get in touch with us and our colleagues in the University of Chile. We'll be pleased to tell them what they have developed.
Okay, thank you. Brian, do you want to come in on that?
Sure, and I mean, just to maybe some qualifications around the use of AI too, because I think a lot of the attention in terms of what we're talking about now isn't it's about monitoring, say, media reports, for use of force incidents and so on. But there's a kind of whole other aspect to what we're trying to do in this monitor, which is to look at the kinds of policies and practices that are in place in law enforcement agencies. And there it takes a lot of contextual, it takes a lot of background kind of expertise to understand what police agencies are doing, how they're reporting it, some of the limitations of that. And through this project, we've been able to establish this kind of global network where we have experts working in different countries. And really, I mean, it's because of that kind of whatever I can say, kind of local knowledge and understanding about how agencies are reporting what they're doing, the kind of work that's going on in the sense of the quality of the data that's released. I mean, you need all that kind of information before you can just go off and kind of scrape some information. So I mean, of course, this, in relationship to media reports, I mean, there's a great deal of potential there, but I don't think a lot of this data stands on its own, right? It needs to be understood. Someone needs to be there to be able to make sense of it. And this is what we're trying to do through establishing this international network.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have another question that's been posted in the chat. It's quite a long question, which seems to involve a couple of elements. So part of the question is about whether there is a statement of common definitions and methods available. The answer to that is yes, to some extent. There is some outline of definitions and methods in the country reports and in the background information on the website. But this is something that we are developing from a fairly general approach for the time being, and that we're developing and refining as we go. And one of the key areas in progress is exactly refining some of these methodological issues, site-related research. The other point that's raised in the question that's there in the chat is about what we mean. I think it's about what we're meaning by lethal force and how we're measuring deaths and injuries and how we're comparing some of that information. Well, the key point is that the headline approach for the research that's behind this website is that we're focusing on deaths. So it's deaths resulting from or connected with uses of force. So it's not a narrow focus only on lethal force using lethal means like firearms. It's deaths related to, resulting from, connected with uses of force. So that is quite broad. We're focusing in on policing and law enforcement, so we've excluded some custody situations. So at this stage, it's quite broad, but within that, there are particular areas of focus. And then the other element of the question there is how we're measuring relative uses of force that are fatal or non-fatal. That, I think, is a question that maybe Ignacio can answer in a minute, to talk about that a little bit more broadly. But before we come to Ignacio, Thomas has raised his hand, so I'll turn to Thomas.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the intent to kill element of that kind of setup in the question. I mean, I think training the training on targeting center body mass as the part that you're most likely to be able to hit has the kind of unfortunate corollary that that is also the place where a lot of the vital organs are, and so you are the likelihood of a fatal shooting if you hit someone's center body mass is higher. But I think from an international standards perspective, at least, that is not the reason why good practice would train to hit center body mass. It's because that's where you're most likely to hit them. And so then thinking about the kind of implications of that for whether or not the case turns out to be a fatality is I mean, I agree with you about the importance of less lethal alternatives, but actually, if a firearm is fired, the likelihood that it turns into a lethal event is also strongly related to the training that is given to the law enforcement officials about then medical care, because the responsibility once you have shot to stop is then immediately to start providing medical assistance, and the likelihood of getting the one assumes criminal suspect to a medical facility for treatment. And so that's where I think you are then likely to see global disparity between the number of cases of shooting and the number of them that turn out to be fatal.
Yes, so Stephen, I would fully agree with Thomas in that the international standards are clear in that the intent is to stop the person from being a threat of death or very serious injury to somebody else. It's not intent to kill, it's an intent to stop the person. And in that course of events, that the person may end up being killed, but it's not intent to kill, it's intent to stop. As far as the indicators are concerned, both are indicators of use and abuse of lethal force are based on the use of firearms. And even though the lethality of firearms is very high, if the intent is really to stop the person and you use it within the legal limits, we find that in many jurisdictions there are many people wounded, more than people killed. So the fact that the lethality is very high does not mean that we cannot expect more people to be wounded than killed, and that we do indeed in practice find in jurisdictions where use of force is not excessive, we do find more people wounded than killed.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left, if I can see if there are any other questions from participants, if anyone would like to raise any other issues about the website or the work.
Stephen, hi. I was just reading
Yes.
through I was just thinking about what the conversation a bit there, and in Jamaica's own human use of force policy, and in Trinidad's own, you don't shoot unless you really have to. The force emphasizes that the policy emphasizes that is either reasonable and necessary, threat to life, threat to property or another. But if you're going to shoot, right, you have to make sure that these bases are covered. It's almost like a checklist in your head, right? Before you actually fire. So what is always interesting for me in doing all of this research around it, NASA and everyone else, is that we still have a high number of fatal shootings. So I'm asking myself all the time, is if I use a checklist, if I'm an officer and I'm thinking about that checklist in my head, the 100 odd fatal shootings that I'm seeing from the police or the INDECOM and the oversight commissions here in Trinidad, the 64 and 59, every time I see those numbers, I think, okay, an officer thought that this was reasonable and necessary or was justified, right? And I think that's the questions that we have to kind of think about, bog ourselves around with in terms of the officers and and the data we get. Every time we see those numbers, if officers are guided by and checking off in their head what these use of force policies say, right? These numbers are supposed to reflect justified means of shooting, but it's not always the case, right? It is not always the case. I mean, in Jamaica, you have many cases of people who are mentally ill, right, getting shot and injured, right, or shot and killed, right? There's been a huge advocacy block in Jamaica, right? And in St. Lucia, you've seen cases similar to that, right? So it tells me that, we have to spend more time, right, on this use of force training, right, in different countries. We may also have a problem with interpretation, even though things are black and white. Maybe it has to be something, and this is like, I think this goes back to the legislation, right? Setting out things in a very statutory way as to what this constitutes. These definitions, these comparable definitions, are somewhat lacking, and this is the noise in the interpretation that we're dealing with, and this is why we probably can't figure out, why this has happened and the way it's happened if a checklist is followed by every officer in a use of force policy outline.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those observations. Yes, indeed. I mean, a hugely complex dimension of the whole question of use of lethal force in policing and law enforcement is how we triangulate and bring together the international standards, the national standards in law, the training of the officers on the ground, the officers' perception in the heat of the moment, and then the ex post facto adjudication of whether or not there was a justified or excusable use of force, etc. The purpose of the lethal force monitoring project is to look at all deaths resulting from uses of force and to try to find ways of monitoring and making accessible information about them in order to try to enhance discussions about accountability of agencies. So it goes beyond the technical issues of the justifiability or not of force in specific incidents, because we can't try to second guess tribunals and courts around the world in that. So to move towards a close, our hour is at its end. This has launched the Monitoring Lethal Force website and has opened some of the perspectives on regional issues and regional reports, and it's identified some of the ongoing issues that require further attention as the project continues to develop and expand. So thank you all very much for attending and for your attention. If there are any remaining questions, you'll find an email address on the new website to which you can address your queries. And we look forward to hearing from you if there are any points that you wish to raise with us and to continue the discussion about. So thank you, everyone, and we will end the session here. Goodbye.